Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to all of our participants online. My name is Simone Maloz, and today we are going to talk about when large-scale restoration is canceled, will communities back themselves into a retreat conversation? If that's not the conversation you want to have at 8:30 this morning, I suggest you find somewhere else to be. So obviously, all kidding aside, we're not starting with a light topic today, but we do want to leave you with why what is happening in our little state of Louisiana should concern you, or there is some lessons that you can learn from our work. So I mentioned I am Simone Maloz. I am the campaign director for a coalition of nonprofits called Restore the Mississippi River Delta. And these are my colleagues here, each representing one of the different organizations. So we have Sam Carter, Charles Sutcliffe, and Kristi Trail. So starting, I'll go in the middle first because Charles will follow me. Charles is a senior advisor of resilience at the National Wildlife Federation. He came to National Wildlife Federation after 10 years of service in the Louisiana's Governor's Office of Coastal Activities, where he served as the state's first Chief Resilience Officer. He's an LSU and an NYU grad, and we're happy to have him on the panel with us today. Following Charles will be Kristi Trail. Kristi is the executive director of a Louisiana-based organization called Pontchartrain Conservancy. Pontchartrain is known as a lake, but it's really an estuary. She will tell you that. But that is a Louisiana-based organization. Kristi is a PE, and she has a background in civil and environmental engineering and spent quite a bit of time in the energy sector before moving over to Pontchartrain Conservancy. And Samantha Carter here is an outreach manager at the National Wildlife Federation. Prior to where she does our outreach work in Louisiana. She goes into coastal communities. She talks about the projects that are happening there. She talks about the risk. One of the fun things about her jobs is that she gets to connect with the culture of Louisiana, which includes chef's work. She's in charge of something called Cook-Off for the Coast, which is a very fun, popular local event. While Sam puts many, many hours into that, I think she would say it's probably one of the more fun parts of her job. She is a GW and a Yale graduate. Thank you for coming with us today. So a little bit about the organization, the coalition that we represent. So we all did a little bit of work in Louisiana. Kristi's, I think, 35 years as a Louisiana-based organization, but some of the national, or if you want to call them international organizations, had started working in Louisiana before Katrina, and then certainly started to work even more after Hurricane Katrina, but we really got formed as a coalition after the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, and that's where we really formed together as a true campaign coalition. We all work together to restore Louisiana's coast, and that comes in a couple of different ways. And that's all we do. These organizations, of course, have other parts of their work that they do, but for this case in particular, all of us put resources, staff, expertise together just to think about how we can restore coastal Louisiana. So as you know, or as we just talked about, or you may know from any kind of climate work that you do, Louisiana's geology, geography, and history has forced our state to make really hard decisions and to be the front line of what impacts are happening because of environmental change and risk. And so we, of course, because we've been through disasters like Katrina, Rita, Laura, Ike, Gustav, we could go on, or things like the Deepwater Horizon, we have kind of been talked about in national circles about those disasters, but we have done such a tremendous amount of work to plan for that now, to be more resilient, to put these structures in place. And surprisingly, as a state, we were really leading in some of those initiatives, including Charles had a climate plan. We have something called a coastal master plan, which started after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. These are all things that we put into place to better protect ourselves in the future, but also to better convey the risk of what's happening in Louisiana to these coastal communities so they can make their own decisions about their future. So this year is a milestone anniversary year in Louisiana. We just surpassed the Deepwater Horizon anniversary, which was 15 years. And then come this August and September, we will be 20 years post-Katrina and Rita. And so it's a time for us to look back and reflect on those things, to think about all these systems that we put in place. We could talk about the success that we've had there, which has been tremendous success. But that's not what you're going to hear about this morning. You're going to hear about how we are turning back, unfortunately, some of those positive post-Katrina, Rita, and Deepwater Horizon reforms. So those disasters did provide a tremendous amount of money to Louisiana. Unfortunately, Louisiana only was able to put some of these protections and large ecosystem restoration projects and structural protection projects in place because of some of those disasters. But we've had about almost $15 billion in levee protection. We've had maybe nearly $5 billion invested in coastal restoration or ecosystem efforts. And all of that is guided by this document that we have, which is based in science, this comprehensive coastal master plan. And so what we have been doing is we've been talking about how we make these investments, and we go out into these communities and we talk about that. And so one of the things that our organization does is every other year we conduct polling. That seems kind of unusual for a nonprofit or a coalition of nonprofits, but it's just to make sure that we are getting a good temperature reading from folks in Louisiana, that our decisions are being made based on what they want. And we just did polling this past spring, and 93% of the people of Louisiana believe in this science-based coastal plan to guide our decision makings. So I tell you that to say that this is not being done in isolation, not being done in a vacuum, that this planning and this effort and these systems that have been put in place after Katrina and Rita that have been really important during things like Deepwater Horizon, this has buy-in from so many of the people in Louisiana that they believe in this science-based plan moving forward. And so that's really important for you to know that as we frame up the future of this discussion today. So today we're going to talk about a cornerstone project of that coastal master plan, and that is called the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion. Through previous coastal master plan processes, and even before Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, when we talked about our coast, ever since we leveed the river, frankly, in 1927, we talked about reconnecting to the river. The river has freshwater and sediment, that's the lifeblood to Louisiana. So that concept of reconnecting to the river has always been really, really important to our plans moving forward. And so because we did get money from Deepwater Horizon, we were able to invest those funds and finally begin construction on a $3 billion river reconnection called the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion. That's the centerpiece of the discussion that we're going to talk about today. That project is designed to reestablish the deltaic processes that created Louisiana, build 20 to 40 square miles. That was once a sustainable and healthy part of our coast that is now rapidly sinking because of subsidence and sea level rise. So I'm going to frame up the discussion that way. So this presentation is designed to ask you in the room with us today and online to ask you two questions. What does it mean to you as adaptation planners and public policy specialists to witness a 20-year program and planning process be undone What does that mean? Maybe by a single politician, by an administration, by a legislature or legislative body, that they can undo planning work. This is pure politics. Are there lessons to be learned from this in the work that you do? Things that we could have done differently, things that you could do differently, and ways to safeguard your work to protect it against decisions just like this. The second question is rooted in the experiences of the people who live in and around this place that we love and where this project is, the Barataria Basin. They are experiencing every type of climate impact, and decades and billions of dollars have been devoted to this major restoration project that's essentially been canceled. The window to build meaningful infrastructure is closing. Costs are rising for all types of construction. People are moving, they are retreating. And incentive structures that continue to favor short-term thinking over the realities of a rapidly changing environment. What have we done to make the case for large-scale restoration? What happens even when solutions that produce measurable positive outcomes cannot be overcome by their detractors or people that will be negatively impacted by it? What if there are no simple solutions to climate problems as big as those that we are experiencing here in coastal Louisiana? Parts of Louisiana, and especially the Barataria Basin, are a dying system. Louisiana's approach has been to build a project of the size and scale that matches the challenges that we face there to save the system. But we ran into a buzzsaw of politics and people who are focused on their short-term needs. I'll come back at the end of the presentation to have a discussion around these questions, but first we'll frame up the context and details a little bit more about what's happening in Louisiana, the Barataria Basin, and the people that live there. So right now, I'll turn it over to Charles.
Great, thanks, Samantha. Yeah, so I'm going to start kind of zoomed out, and so you guys can appreciate kind of the larger coastal context of the problem, and then zoom into the Barataria Basin so you understand kind of the different dynamic changes that the region is facing, and then pass it on to Sam and Kristi, who will be kind of going into more detail on it. So Louisiana is facing some of the highest rates of land loss in the world. We are also really transparent about that risk, so we produce these maps. We used to always make red maps, and then we changed them to blue recently, but this is showing historic land loss. So from the 30s to 2016, we've lost the size of the state of Delaware already. It's not coming back. This is, so the land loss is showing up as blue, and there are a few tiny areas of dark green that you can kind of see here, and then here, there's where the river is still connected to the wetlands, and there's a tiny bit of growth, but the overall story is a tremendous land loss. And that's because, and this is kind of a central idea behind why this project that we want to talk about is so important, is the river literally built the state of Louisiana. So this is a picture that maybe Haley worked on that LSU did a while back. So this is kind of just walking through how the river literally built the state of Louisiana. And so this is back 6,500 years ago. We're going to see time on the bottom, and then we'll see a curve of land gain. So the river, was up back by Baton Rouge, and then so we have these deltas formed. And so the river and its distributaries are shown in these white lines. There's a sediment plume that's kind of brownish and greenish, and then the wetlands are in this kind of dark green. So over time, the river will move, create a new delta, build this land. So this is around, I can't even see it on the screen, but we're 3,500 years ago. So Louisiana is really relatively new. So we're kind of, the river's moving. So it wasn't until 2,500 years ago when Lake Pontchartrain, where Kristi does most of her work, was kind of pinched off from the Gulf of Mexico at first. And so as the river changes course, it's depositing all this sediment, it's just sending the spring floods or the winter floods kind of into those wetlands, and it created a new delta. This old delta is closer to Simone's house where she grew up, down by Lafourche. This is going to end up being one of the borders for the region we're going to talk about in a minute. And then the newest delta, the newest piece of Louisiana is the Plaquemine Delta. So just 500 years ago is when, do y'all see that too? No, it's just me, good. Something's happening on my screen.
Automatic restart.
My password.
Software update.
All right, so this is the delta, the last place where the river naturally went. But like Simone mentioned, in 1927, after the Great Flood, all that river water coming out of its banks every year. The river was kind of managed kind of landowner by landowner, or kind of through less formal means until the Corps came in and federalized the system. And once we put those levees up, that land building process was kind of broken. And so the first thing we did was do the levees, that's shown up in orange. Then we cut off those distributaries and put in some other engineering structures to kind of lock the river in place. And then that's what kind of led us to this land loss process. So between, first putting up the levees and where we are today, you can kind of see that coast kind of shrink back and then really change. There are other processes going on Louisiana's coast that are also contributing to our land loss. So we've got, the levees, but then there's this natural process of subsidence. There's sea level rise that's going to become the main driver for coastal change in the next coming decades. We've also dug canals all through our coast for navigation, to extract resources, to get oil and gas. Hurricanes themselves tear up wetlands, and the oil spill was terrible for the wetlands as well. Here's what it looks like a little bit on the ground. This is kind of a little more zoomed in on the region we're going to be talking about today. So this is kind of close to the Jefferson-Plaquemine border called Bayou DuPont. So we're just going to watch that little squiggly bayou as we go through the decades. You can see it's from 52 to 98, and then 2010, and then here we were in 2012, and we'll come back and show that later. So as we lose that land, the storm surge risk is closer and closer to communities, even if the communities aren't moving to that shoreline, kind of like they do in a Florida situation. So we're seeing, all these oranges and reds are, 10 to 15 feet of storm surge risk. The dark blues and purples are 16 to 21 plus feet of storm surge risk. And this is our initial condition. So this is where we are today in 2023. Through the master plan that we do, we also project into the future to try to understand how the coast is going to continue to change as we do this. So this is a map, what we call the future without action. So if we don't build any new projects, or we don't continue kind of on this plan we're on, what's going to look like. So this is an additional 3,000 square miles of coastal land loss into the future that we're looking at here. And of course, that means the storm surge risk is going to be even higher. And so a lot of the colors are the same, but the depths are deeper towards the edge, and it's going much further inland. This is our storm surge future without action. So we're going to focus in on this little area right here, where there are mostly reds and blues and purples and all the wrong colors is the area that we're going to talk about. So to kind of zoom in, like what's going on with the people there. And so the border of this region is Bayou Lafourche, on the western side. So that's a former distributary of the Mississippi. We've got the Mississippi River where it is today as the western, eastern boundary. And we've got Lafourche Parish, and then Jefferson Parish is in the middle, and then Plaquemines Parish is where most of the conversation is going to be focused on. Plaquemines Parish, 2000 to 2018, had about 23,000 people living there with really low population density. They lost 27% of their population after Katrina, and then when they came back, they regained a lot of it, but most of the people are living in the protected levee system. So you can see this map is showing population density. So right here, if that's, yeah, it's gonna work. So this is where most of the folks concentrated, and then you can see there's a few little light colors kind of going down the river along the river. Jefferson Parish is a really different parish. It's kind of a suburban community at the top, right outside of New Orleans, but then it stretches all the way down to our barrier islands at the bottom. And again, most of the folks there are living kind of inside this protection system. And then the public services kind of reflect that shift too. So we're seeing the services move inside the protection system, just as we're seeing that the people move there. And so this map is showing you kind of just where most of the things are. There's a school and a EMS station or two down the river, but there's less and less public serving facilities down there. Another big piece of the situation in coastal Louisiana in general, but specifically here, is kind of insurance and affordability. So if the storm surge isn't pushing you out, or the land loss, it's going to be the cost of living. And so Louisiana already has property insurance rates 3 times higher than the national average. It's about $5,300 a year. The residual market, so if you can't get homeowners insurance in the private market, you're on Citizens, which we call our residual market. They're raising rates every time you turn around. So 2023 was a big one. They raised it by 63% overall, but in coastal parishes it was up to 111%. So you take that 5,000, you add to that, and then NFIP, flood insurance program. The areas that we're talking about are some of the highest increases in the entire nation there. And so this little map that I'm showing is a zip code by zip code place where you can kind of see how much your rate's increasing by. So it's 454% to 545% in the project area. So it's an additional cost of $4,000 to $4,600 a year for some of these folks. And then to keep in mind, just kind of put it in perspective, the median home value in the project area is not that high. So 163,000 in kind of the overall project area. Lafitte is a community a little to the north side of it, but then some of these communities we're going to talk about in the future are a much different story. And so we've got all kinds of different income levels living in this area, and affordability is a huge problem. So what do folks do down there? What's the economy look like? This is from a study that the National Academies is sponsored and Dillard University is leading kind of the economic analysis of it. And so this is just for, again, context. We've got a lot of, from a GDP point of view, it's really about oil and gas, and it's about water conservation. But when you look at the jobs and what people actually do, fishing is a huge part of that. So fishing is way up on the jobs part, but obviously lower on the output side. We are also at risk from some of these transition risks. So this area, like I just said, oil and gas is a big part of the economy. This is a refinery right next door to the project site that was gonna close. They were put it up for sale. It got hit by Hurricane Ida and flooded. It was even less attractive of a purchase after that. It's eventually going to become an export facility, but it's going to have far fewer jobs as an export facility than it did as an oil and gas refinery. But we've also got this kind of LNG boom going on in this area. So there's this huge city-sized LNG export facility happening just south of the project site. So we've kind of got contradictory messages going on the economy side, especially in relationship to the risk. A little bit about the fishing industry going on here. So this is a very productive fishery. About a third of all the state fisheries activities happening in this region. And it's really spread across shrimp, oyster, crab, all the things that we kind of do best in Louisiana. This is where the shrimp is actually coming from in this project area. So the environmental impact statement kind of broke everything up into little pieces. We want to understand where activity is happening. 30% is coming from this kind of 2010 here, 210, kind of up along the river. The majority of the activity is happening in this 211, but it's so big and it kind of really stretches into the Gulf some, and so it's hard to say what's going on here. But what I would say too, this last little piece down here where the river is still kind of releasing into the Gulf of Mexico, 3 million pounds of shrimp are coming out of that area too. So the river is not bad for fisheries per se. It's like a complex system. The shrimping industry is having a hard time, and I don't know where everybody's from, but it's a big storyline in Louisiana. Just how difficult it is, how the economics have really shifted. Dockside values are at the lowest point ever. They're really crashing, and we're also seeing people exit the shrimping. This is a graph just kind of showing commercial licenses in the area over time. I've got this little pink arrow here. This is where the oil spill was. So even the oil spill was nothing compared to kind of where we are today in terms of white shrimp and brown shrimp prices. And that's a story about globalization and imports and lots of things, not just environmental change, but it's all kind of stirred together. Oyster industry is much more stable and doing much better from a value point of view, from people staying in the industry. And you can see the oyster industry, 92% of that 1/3 of the state total is coming from this 210 area right here along the Mississippi River. So that's kind of the economy and the people, and then real quick on just kind of specifics on the environmental change that they're facing, just to kind of paint a picture of why this project was so important and where we're kind of going after this. So they've lost 29% of their land area since 1932. Every 2.8 years or so, they're getting a major hurricane. Is kind of the average that they've seen there, including some of like historic storms. Sea level rise and subsidence, those are going up. The number of very hot days, we were talking about earlier, heat, that's just going up as it gets hotter. The temperatures, the precipitation is actually decreasing, but when it does rain, it's raining harder. All these things that we know. just to say that they're really experiencing like really every type of climate impact in this area. And then the oil spill, as Simone mentioned, it's been 15 years, and to kind of look back at the statistics, it kind of jogs your memory, like, wow, that was so crazy. 87 days of continuous gushing of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. A slick the size of the state of Virginia is what was kind of floating towards and landing on our wetlands in Louisiana. Specifically, the land loss pieces, Jefferson Parish, I said, is kind of in the middle of this area. 42% of their land mass is projected to be gone in 50 years. 55% of Plaquemines Parish in 50 years. This is tidal flooding, a graph that was made for the EIS, or a chart was made for the EIS. So we're seeing different communities that are outside of the big levee system, south of the project area. What is their sunny day flooding change expected to be? So now in the 2020s, it's about 10 to 30 days, per year, they'll see tidal flooding, but it goes up to 333 days of the year in the 2060s. And so we're seeing conditions deteriorate. And then, so what does that mean? This is my last slide. I'm going to give it over to Kristi. What does that mean for the economy? Again, this is the Dillard and National Academy study. Just looking 25 years into the future, just looking at current rates of land loss, not predicting a hurricane strike or anything else, they're expecting a loss of $2.6 billion of output, losing 5,000 jobs, and losing all that tax revenue. So the area has serious challenges and serious issues, and so Kristi's going to come up and talk a little bit about some of the solutions that the state has put into place to try to address this in a systematic way, but then also the specifics of the project itself that we're gonna do some things for. So thanks, Kristi.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everybody. Thank y'all for joining us nice and early this morning. So good lead in to what I'm gonna talk about today. I don't know how many of you have heard our story in Louisiana and our big coastal land loss issue. So if it's your first time hearing it, hopefully it's like very eye-opening and enlightening to you. But I think it's important to know that, I'm a Louisiana native, and growing up, and even today, fast forward to today, Louisiana's always really been at the bottom of every ranking you can imagine, right? Like high poverty rates and education and just so many things. But here's one place where we are a leader, where the rest of the country is looking to us at ways to restore this massive land loss crisis. We brought in scientists and engineers, not just from Louisiana, but from all over the country and even the world, to put together this world-class science-based plan. And, again, as a Louisianian, we're number 50 and everything. It's like, this is something we're so good at. So I'm going to talk a little bit about today. You've heard the crisis and the issues. Now, what's our plan to fix it? So how do we go about addressing this massive issue to save Louisiana? And it's important to us because we live there, but it's important to all of you all because of things like we all like the shrimp on our table for dinner. It's a delicacy, but nonetheless delicious. But the oil and gas infrastructure, so even all the way up here in the Northeast, Louisiana's supplying that natural gas to heat homes and power up stoves and ovens and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So post Hurricane Katrina in 2005, a lot of restructuring happened. It was an opportunity to kind of clean up some things in the government for us. So that was forming a new state agency to look after things such as restoration, but also protection. So when we say restoration, that's rebuilding the wetlands, protection, things like levees and flood walls, and then putting together a whole framework to make those decisions. So how are we going to go about addressing this? So much has happened, so much has changed, but the sad part is there was an opportunity because not only was there that much attention, but the money was coming in. So how are we gonna make these changes and start addressing this land loss crisis? So there's the analytical challenge of looking at, okay, we have a very complex coastal system here. We have the river over here, but we're still losing land in areas where the river is not. How far out are we gonna look? Kind of landed on like the 50-year planning horizon. What other scenarios do we need to look at? Subsidence rates, sea level rise, any future hurricanes coming again, all these different scenarios. And then again, how do you determine which projects you are actually going to implement? If you had unlimited money and time and resources, right, we could just do them all, but that's not the reality of the way the world works, right? So doing that risk analysis of what's your ROI on some of these projects, where communities live, long-term, short-term, you know, and then of course, what does the community actually want? What do they want to see in their neighborhood, and making sure that's an important part of the process and that those voices are heard. So we put together a statewide coastal master plan. So we talk about a master plan, that's like the big broad process of all the projects that the state wants to implement. Doesn't mean they're necessarily gonna happen, but like, here's a plan, so that if and when we get the money and the buy-in and the, you know, after the community meetings, we have a prioritized list of which projects we can knock out first, or even simultaneously. So it just provides a great framework of having all that put together. Now similarly, we each year then look at what's the actual budget and what can we execute in a year, but the master plan is really that big, long planning process to put it all together. It's also a communication tool that we can use to help inform decision-making at every level within our state agency, but also at local levels, like at, you know, of course we have parishes, not counties, I think you've heard that a few times today, but at the local parish level, right, at the city level. So having that master plan really provides that good framework for that. So we'll talk a little bit about the 2023 coastal master plan. So again, because it's big, broad-based, we do it about every 6-7 years. So the most recent edition that we have was completed in 2023. We're already working on our next one, which will be the 2029 master plan. So this is like why we look so far out. It's a project list. It has a solid foundation of science. I think that's a really key takeaway today, is all the science and engineering that goes into not only the projects, like what is it gonna take to execute these, but the ROI. So really like the cost analysis, how much marsh is it gonna build, what's it gonna take to build it, like a lot of science goes into building this master list. And so how do we come up with all the different projects that are listed in there? They're modeled against future different landscapes, so again, subsidence rates, sea level rise scenarios. So we have a scenario with 1/2 foot of sea level rise. We have a scenario with 1 foot of sea level rise. So all these different scenarios are in there. And you'll see on some of our maps, you'll see some little footnotes, it'll say 0.5 SLR or 0.5 sea level rise, so that in that scenario. So you'll see that on some of there. So in our 2023 coastal master plan, you can see there's 61 restoration projects. So again, those are things where we're rebuilding the wetlands in a variety of ways. It could be digging up dirt and dumping it into an open area of wetlands to plant grass. It could be something like the river diversion project, which we're gonna dig into a little bit. 12 structural risk reduction projects. So again, levees, flood walls, think of things like that. And then what we call non-structural risk reduction. So again, like technical terminology, but when we talk about non-structural risk reduction, essentially it's raising homes. Could be, you know, raising some bridges and things like that, but essentially that's things like raising homes. So the objectives of the coastal master plan are flood protection for the communities, right? So making sure we can continue to live in these areas. Restoring some natural processes. So again, we're gonna dig into one of those big ones that we're really looking at, reconnecting the river to the wetlands. Coastal habitats, so value in maintaining the birds and the fisheries. Cultural heritage, again, this is the way of life for so many that live in South Louisiana. But always remembering we have a working coast too. So there's a lot of industry on the coast. Again, a lot of that natural gas that fuels the rest of the country. All that's important infrastructure to make sure that we protect. So, few slides with a lot of graphics on here talking about our master plan process. So starts off as, essentially a giant wish list. We gather all these candidate projects from all across the coastal part of the state, which is, again, we're really just focusing on the coastal area. So gathering all those candidate projects. Then we do some predictive modeling. There's 3 related models I'm gonna discuss on the next couple of slides, and then comparing those, developing modeling alternatives, and then making those decisions, developing a draft plan, open for comments to the public, creating a final plan, and stakeholder engagement all the way through. So at each iteration of these, there's opportunities for members of the public to weigh in, and those come in various sizes and shapes. So again, right now we're in the process of working on the 2029 coastal master plan. So they have small working groups where they picked out some leaders in different areas from across the state, like let's get together, what are y'all hearing, what do you want to do? So those meetings are happening more internally. Then they'll have a public meeting that's open to anyone to come, and they'll do those all across the state. to gather input from people all across the state to make that final master plan, right? So stakeholder engagement all the way through. So when we talk about the selection process, so whittling down this wish list of everything that we wish could happen and putting it in one final master plan. So coming up with the projects, they're gathered, they're formatted for modeling. We also look at the previous master plan and what were some things that were in there, should they stay in? What were some things suggested in the previous master plan that didn't make the cut? Is it something that we should maybe revisit this time? There could be new projects, maybe it's submitted by the public, an NGO such as us. I mean, we're like looking after specific areas in one part of the state, but we've done a lot of modeling in our part of the state, so we have valuable input to provide to this process. Engineering firms, really anyone, like a landowner, so this is where they start gathering other wish list items from everyone, and then the price tag. So we've got to go through all these hundreds of projects with price tags, and these are huge price tags, like hundreds of billions of dollars here when we put together the whole plan, and it's whittled down as we go through the whole process. So that's kind of this projects piece, and then the modeling piece of, again, this is essentially like, what's the ROI if we were to implement project A and really projects all together? So if we were to build all of these projects together, what's the ROI and what does that mean for some of these communities? So looking at the physical, ecological processes, the feedbacks that drive the change to the landscape, sediment transport, salinity, vegetation cover, what's the water level? These are all the scenarios that are applied, as well as like sea level rise scenarios, subsidence rates, all those kind of stuck into this model. So I know it's like a complicated graphic here, but it just shows you like it's a very thorough scientific process going through these predictive models. And then we take all of that and that becomes some of the foundation for surge modeling, wave modeling, essentially how deep is the water across the landscape at different times, different storm scenarios. 61 different storms from 1970 to 2019. So you can see these paths of impact on Louisiana's coast. But again, understanding what that means to these restoration projects. Will they be impacted and will they protect communities? Will they buffer storm surge, et cetera? The risk models, of course, like on the ground where you get the water. So looking at the risk model to measure impacts of water levels from the surge and wave models on communities, on assets, on infrastructure. The state has like a structure inventory working with the Corps of Engineers because the Corps of Engineers has Corps of Engineers processes that are way complicated. So the state really got their own kind of structural inventory. But yeah, so you can see just kind of like how this is all layered together when they do some of these analyses. And looking at like elevations of homes in these communities. And then again, prioritizing those. So most importantly, not just having a, jumbled together batch of projects, but prioritizing them so that, again, if and when that money comes through, making sure there's a prioritized list that everybody agrees upon that has been through this thorough process to determine which projects get implemented. So decision drivers and constraints, understanding all of that. Outputs elevated with advisory groups made up of stakeholders, regional groups, local governments, all the people. And then so it's a very robust project selection. Okay, so we talk about one particular project, the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion. I'm going to point out that in every single one of our master plans, which again, since Hurricane Katrina hit us 20 years ago in 2005, this project has been in every single one of our master plans. So every iteration, it's always been there. It's been fully adopted, embraced by all the communities, like every time we've gone through different governors, different administrations. So it's just, it's been a big project that we've been talking about for a really long time. It was selected for inclusion in the 2012 plan. That was the first plan that had the modeling in there of the project outcomes, where they really started to look at if this was built, how much land would it create and how much storm surge would it buffer. That modeling was really robust in the 2012 plan. It was again put in the 2017 plan, an assumed part of our strategy in the 2023 plan. And so the thing is also with these projects, when you do the modeling, you have to assume all these projects are going to be built because it affects one and the other, right? If you rebuild some marsh here and a levee here, well, that levee is only going to work if the marsh is there. So just knowing that the modeling is very dependent upon all the projects working together as planned. So we're gonna, okay, go to the animation on this slide, so let's hope that it works. Oh yes, can y'all see it? Hopefully online can see it as well, because it's an animated slide, so hopefully the folks online can see it as well. So it's showing how the diversion will pull sediment from the Mississippi River, that's the Mississippi River on the right-hand side there, flowing down into the Gulf, pulling sediment from the river into Barataria Bay. So that's the open area on this map. It's like, dark brown, black. But you can see now in this animation how it is building land over time, because that sediment is now being restored into the wetlands there. So the sediment diversion is designed to mimic nature and address one of the root causes of our coastal crisis. It is a highly engineered structure. So you can just see here on this schematic all the components that go into building this, but it's really restoring the way that Louisiana was built in the first place. The river built all that land, as you heard from Charles and Simone. The river built all of this, all day, every day. It was dumping sediment and water out there, and we sealed it off with the levees. So now it's time to restore that connection. But again, highly engineered system that will not just free flow all the time, like we used to, but be able to look at the flow rate of the river. And, are we in a flood stage? Are we in a drought stage? How are the wetlands doing? Do we need to remaneuver something? So again, highly engineered system. But at the end of the day, it's still a simple process. It's really just getting that sediment and water back into the wetlands to rebuild it while maximizing the amount of water leaving the river, right? So that we can have an estuary, which is what this Barataria Basin is. It's an estuary. It needs both the water and the sediment. And there's a lot of talk about the numbers, like how much land is it gonna build? Well, there's still value in having that 1 inch of water. That's in estuaries or nurseries for our little baby fish that come in from the Gulf. They have their babies in there. So there's still value in all of those components of the wetlands. So interestingly, with this project's been in the plan, like I said, since the early days after Hurricane Katrina hit us and we put together that first master plan in 2007, it was like, we've got to do this, reconnect, but we knew how expensive it was going to be. So you look back at again, horrible situation with the Deepwater Horizon spill that offered an opportunity then for some money because the damages from that spill did impact this part of the state. So then you can use that funding right now to restore that area, and that's where the two things really came together. So again, now you got to go through permitting because you're dealing with the Corps of Engineers and the levee, and the Mississippi River is such a crucial component of commerce for the country, all that navigation, right? So the river's used all day, every day, huge ports all up and down the river. So the Corps is very protective of that and their protection system of the levee. So it's not just, we're going to reconnect the river to the wetlands now and cut a hole in this levee. Like the amount of permitting that needs to go through is pretty significant. So you can see some of these decision gates here built out through this process. So because there was the Deepwater Horizon spill, there was also the opportunity to start evaluating, okay, if that money from the spill, does that really offset the damages? So those two together were happening in parallel all through this process. So there were comment periods all throughout this, 60-day comment periods. People could read these. Now again, still lengthy documents, but making sure all those documents were out and available to the public. So how did that happen? There was over 300 meetings that were happening for this project to say, like, were we getting the public input from everybody in all these communities? There were, again, like 12,000 people reached. I think you can see that on this slide with all these meetings, talking about a variety of issues at every single meeting. So what types of topics were covered, like what types of things were people wanting to hear about, and how do they feed that into this project design and ultimately selection? So here's where we look at some of the benefits of this project. It's comprehensive and sustainable, and it will restore the region. So it's not really a local project. It's not small, and ultimately will reduce storm surge for these communities, including New Orleans. We have a huge levee system protecting the city of New Orleans, but you still have to have the wetlands in front of that to buffer if a storm were to hit coming from that direction. And also just other recreational land use benefits as well, which we haven't talked about, but things like duck hunting, bird watching. We're sportsman's paradise down in Louisiana, so people love to come down there and enjoy the wetlands for a variety of things. So you saw some of these slides when Charles was talking Bayou DuPont in 2012. So when he was kind of going through from the 1950s all the way to 2012, and this is kind of where he left it, like You can see a remnant of a bayou in there if you look really closely in this satellite imagery. But here's some work that the state did to restore this particular area. So it is possible. You can dig up some dirt and you can rebuild some of this area. And now you're kind of back to that picture from the 1950s, right? We restored Bayou DuPont. But let's just look at the scale of that. So all the time and work invested to rebuild this Bayou DuPont, it's a little tiny blip on that map on the left side. Whereas the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion, if you look at the green imagery there, the image on the right, that's all the land that would create. So that, again, the ROI, like what are we getting here? The other component of the marsh creation, while there's work to dig and rebuild a section of marsh, it's really not sustainable for the long term because it's gonna sink. That's just a natural deltaic process. And a storm may come through and wipe it all out in 2 years. With the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion, you have a continuous source where it's just continually pumping water and sediment in there. It creates over 6,000 acres after 6 years in operation. After 30 years in operation, 17,000 acres. And again, depending on sea level rise in different scenarios, but if we were to do that same amount of land, it would cost about $4 billion with dredging. So you could build that amount of land with dredging and just dumping all that sediment in there, but would it be sustainable? No, it's gonna sink and a storm's gonna come wipe it out. I think, is this my slide to transition to Sam?
You don't wanna talk about the impact of this thing?
Do the math,
Oh, yeah.
and then
Okay, the next, sorry, on the presentation view, I can see like the next slide coming in. Okay, so what's gonna happen with reintroducing all this fresh water and sediment into the Barataria Basin? Are there gonna be impacts that people, may have negative impacts, right? Yes, you're gonna see some increased water levels in some communities because again, this area's been starved for so long. The fisheries, there's gonna be a change. If an area's gotten really marine and salty, you have a different type of marine species that are living there now, and now you're introducing fresh water. So it's gonna change the species that are living there now. So again, change, but all things that we can manage. Dolphins have now found their way this far north up into our state, which again, they were not there 50 years ago because it was solid land. But now that they're there, how are we gonna figure out to get the dolphins out of there? So there, may be some impacts with introducing the fresh water. Again, looking at this system, highly engineered to ensure that the flow rates are, like we can manage those impacts. The other part of the funding of building the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion is money was set aside to manage these impacts. So fully recognize there's gonna be impacts. There's gonna be some increases in water levels. There's gonna be impacts to some of the fisheries. Fully recognized. That's why money was set aside to mitigate that. So to do things like elevating houses, to build some bulkheads in some communities, even to buy people out if they were like, you know what, I'm out, I wanna leave this particular community. Fishermen that are looking for a different career path. Okay, I used to fish for oysters, now I'm gonna fish for crawfish because that's a saltwater species versus a freshwater species. So money set aside to change their fishing gear. So we have scenarios looking at what if we were to do all of those things, build the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion and offer these mitigation dollars, what is the ultimate impact to these communities? So if we look at in today's decade and the 2020s-ish, no project, how many days do those communities flood just from tidal flooding? That's something that Charles was talking about, right? We still see that dry weather flooding from the tide coming in, 33 days. If we do the project and we have those mitigation dollars in today's decade, no days of flooding. Fast forward to the 2040s, if nothing is built, no mitigations offered, 198 days of flooding. 2040s, if we do build the project and offer the mitigation, back down to 0, right? So all these different scenarios you can look at, all these different things that, where the state is offering for these communities that would be impacted by this. So, going all the way out to the 2060s, you can see that drastic change there. So some benefits for the fisheries with the dollars injected into that as part of this plan. New seed grounds for oysters. Oysters are the one type of marine life that can't really move themselves. They build almost their own little reefs there and they're not really movable, whereas like shrimp and crabs and fish, like they can eventually migrate out, right? But even looking at things like shrimp, that's, I kind of talked about like different gear for some of the commercial fishermen to increase their efficiency, right? If maybe they've got to go a little bit further out. gear enhancement for crabs, for finfish, some marketing support. Again, Charles talked a little about the crisis with the shrimpers and that we're facing in South Louisiana. But commercial fishers in the Barataria Basin, they have economic pressures just because of the declining productivity because the estuary is collapsing. So something needs to be done to restore that fishery anyway. So that's where this state funding, the state has worked to get the Deepwater Horizon funding to help these communities if this project's built, but they go together. The two things have to go together. So the project has to be built in order to get those mitigation dollars in there. So we talked a little bit about the dolphins, $40 million, that's still a lot of money. Set aside to monitor, to see where the dolphins are going, fund efforts to reduce other stressors on the dolphin population, and a UME, I don't know if y'all know what that means, but it's like an unusual, now I gotta help me, marine event, where you do see like a large mortality of a species. So, if that were to be declared in the Barataria Basin with the operation of the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion, setting aside a contingency fund to offset that. This is my changing point, this is my changing point, so thank you, I needed a prompt there. I'm now gonna turn it over to Sam Carter, she's gonna talk to us about engaging with the community on not only this project, but with the Coastal Master Plan.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'll just point out for anyone coming from the Western time zones, this was a little rude to schedule us at 8:30. So bear with me, Charles signed me up for this. I am much better in a boat. But thank you for showing up this early in the morning. My name is Sam Carter, I work for the National Wildlife Federation. I'm part of a coalition with all these guys. And I spend most of my time when I'm lucky out in a boat or eating a lot of good food with people in Louisiana. I stole this title from my favorite podcast, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But I just briefly wanted to talk about our coalition and our work. The three-legged stool model is cliche, but we do really center our work around policy science and community engagement. We have a large outreach team of members of all the organizations that are part of our coalition. And so we are on the ground and in community doing this work. And so, our outreach approach, we think about it kind of in these terms of education and engagement. One of the sessions yesterday was kind of talking about the funding, and then to put it in funding terms, I think it's the outputs and outcomes, which I always mix up. But we were out there, talking to people about the science and using a lot of those slides I think you guys just saw. And we do that through a lot of different methods. My favorite is getting to go on a boat. And then, really hoping that that turns around and means that people are going to take some sort of action, whether that's showing up to a public meeting and using their voice to talk about why wetlands are important to them, writing op-eds, doing all sorts of things, social media, hosting events of their own. There's kind of an unlimited number of actions people can take. I tried to come up with a list of people we've worked with. This is not exhaustive. I didn't really bother to get into the kind of the geography or demographics. We've spent a lot of time, getting into the DEIJ of it all and doing trainings. And so that is also very centered in our work. That is not what we're talking about today. Just know that we do think about that stuff a lot. We really center this work in relationship building. We live in these communities, we work in these communities. It is not just kind of dine and ditch. I'll be using a lot of food jokes throughout this. And partnerships. There's a slide we didn't use today, kind of with these concentric circles about the networks and partners that we have, and it is really impressive, the networks and relationships that we've built over, really the 20 years that this group has been working on these issues. So I'm going to talk really briefly about my work, just kind of as an example of kind of how we do some of this. When I, used to give my kind of like coastal 101 presentation, I used to play this video of, there's a clip when the Simpsons go to New Orleans. It's like 5 minutes long of Homer just like eating his way through New Orleans. Every restaurant he goes to is a real New Orleans restaurant. Every dish that he talks about is a real like unique New Orleans dish. Lisa cuts in at one point and is like, and there's historical sites. And then they go right back to like eating more food. But I do this to say that like the food culture in Louisiana is incredibly important. And there's a reason I like working with chefs, and it's because there's this like direct connection that they have to the resource. They work directly with fishermen. So many of the ingredients that make these dishes that are part of Louisiana's unique culinary culture come straight from our wetlands. Chefs and restaurants in South Louisiana are often like many celebrities. They have huge social media followings. There's a whole set of food reporters. And so they have kind of their own built-in audience. They're business owners, they've built these, literal kind of like empires of restaurant groups. And a lot of them are from Louisiana and have a long history. They grew up hunting and fishing here. They have a real like connection. And so working with them has been, really fruitful and a lot of fun and very tasty. And so this is just to kind of get into some of the species stuff. I'll get into it a little bit later about the opposition and the fisheries. A lot of the opposition is coming from the shrimp and oyster industry. But what we don't talk about a lot is the fresh end of the estuary, which is really even more vulnerable in a lot of ways. And there's things like crawfish and alligator that are also things that we like to eat in Louisiana, and are also at risk here. And even the things like crab and shrimp and all those things need that fresh end of the estuary for certain parts of their life cycle. And so the reason that we have all these wonderful things is because of the river, not in spite of it. And so when we talk about reconnecting the river to the Delta, it is to save this kind of really productive ecosystem. And so, doing outreach, one thing I've learned is that it's a lot easier to get people to come to the table if there's food on the table. And we really like alliteration, so we have done a lot of different events over the years, and had a lot of fun. And this has been a really good way to engage people on the coast. And we've just done a lot of fun stuff over the years. So these are some of the things we've done. We've done fishing trips, it's cook off for the coast. We've done, dock days. I don't know, any Louisiana people know that's Dickie Brennan. That's like 3 pickup trucks of mine ago. He's eating alligator chili before we went to see Davis Pond, which is a freshwater diversion site that we use as like an example to go see, the river building land. And so this work, often results in these actions that I was talking about. So this is a magazine called The Local Palette. Boyce just came out with a book about the river. I can't remember, did you say what year it came out? I can't remember. But, this is just about chefs taking action on the coast. Anna Marie Shrimp, if they freeze their shrimp, you can probably get it shipped here. on one of those sites that does stuff like that. This is Melissa Martin. She has got a cookbook called Mosquito Supper Club. She also has a restaurant by the same name. If you're in New Orleans, I highly recommend it. She's from Chauvin, Louisiana. It is one of those places like at the very end of the road. And you know, this is just them talking about using the resources that are available and potentially shifting things that are on their menu and not relying on these same 5, you know, highly commercial species. And that if we have to deal with a transition in the ecosystem, can we adapt our menus and our palettes to help get our fishermen through some sort of transition. And then this is just another one kind of directly about Mid-Barataria. Chef Dana Hahn is a very active chef that we work with a lot. And this was about, you know, restaurants really needing to transition during COVID and asking that fishermen also, you know, help with this transition during, you know, these ecosystem changes, and that we're gonna need to change no matter what, and that restoration projects like Mid-Barataria are gonna be necessary for the future. And then this is just a slide. Again, we get called out. I'm from California, but I've been doing this work for 11 years. And like I said, like I live here, I work here, and every time there's a hurricane, you know, we go out and help muck houses and repair roofs. And so, you know, these are our communities too. And I guess I'm just saying that to say that, like, to some people, I will always be an outsider, but we care about this work a lot. And yeah, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about Plaquemines Parish, and with the disclaimer that I'm from California. I am not a historian. I'm not speaking for the people of Plaquemines Parish here. This is just my like observations, some background, some stories after 11 years of working on the ground here. I'm gonna need some water. So this is a map, just to confuse you, looking a little different. This is New Orleans, up here, Belchase, going down, and that's the Birdfoot. I guess I can use the mouse here. This is the Birdfoot, so this is the end of the river. And so these are just some of the towns that we're gonna talk about. This is Phoenix, Bohemia, Port Sulphur, Empire, Buras, Venice. The project, Mid-Barataria is like somewhere in here where Myrtle Grove is. And then this is like the satellite imagery is kind of weird, but like this is all water. Don't be confused, it's not. And then just to kind of give you a sense of what Plaquemines is like, this, we have a friend we work with, Ryan Lambert, who's got a fishing lodge right here. This is a boat launch we use a lot of the time. This is the Mississippi River up here. This is another boat dock over here, and this is Barataria Bay on this side. This stretch of road right here is probably not much bigger than like 2 city blocks, maybe an avenue. And so just to give you kind of a sense of how much water there is down here, and how much land is really left. And there's, you know, there's levees on both sides here. And then this is a photo I took up near Myrtle Grove, near the project site. And one of the boat drivers that I was out with that day was just telling me that when he grew up, his family had a camp out here, that they used to play football out here, that it was a field, and now it is just totally open water. So just to give you kind of like a sense of the time frame of how fast things are changing. And I know I said I wasn't a historian, but you can't tell this story and not go back to the flood of 1927, because it does still get brought up in conversation. But this flood, you know, is the reason we have the modern day levee system. And the reason this is kind of so important to the Plaquemine story and to the Mid-Barataria story is, you know, in this map, this is the flood area in green here. Right here, I don't know if you can see these little red arrows. Right here is Carnarvon, where in the middle of the night, is 1927, as the story goes, some rich New Orleans bankers decided to blow the levee to save New Orleans, and in doing so flooded out poor communities in St. Bernard, many communities of color. Turns out they didn't need to because levee had broken already farther upriver, and like the whole thing was unnecessary. But this really kind of sets up this narrative of Plaquemines and St. Bernard being used as like a sacrifice to save New Orleans. And this like level of mistrust and, you know, things happening, you know, in the dead of night and things not being, you know, okay for whatever reason. And so, and then we lead, and we covered these in previous slides, but after the flood of 1927, you know, we had a system that looked something like this, and then we end up with something more like this, which led to our land loss. Another project that's kind of central to this story is the Mr. Go. We call it Mr. Go, it's the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. This was a 76-mile long channel that was supposed to be a shortcut to the port, so you didn't have to go up the Mississippi River. They moved more dirt for this project than they did in the building of the Panama Canal. More dynamite here, blew up a lot of pristine cypress swamp. It let salt water up into the system all the way up to Lake Maurepas, which is the little lake past Lake Pontchartrain. And ultimately impacted almost 1,000 square miles of wetland habitat. That's, what did I say here? 3 times the size of all 5 boroughs for the New Yorkers here. And this really directly led to the catastrophic and deadly flooding in Katrina. The wetland loss here, you know, helped create the funnel effect that joined forces with the industrial canal and broke the levees in the lower Ninth Ward. I won't get into the Katrina stuff. We're gonna deal with a lot of that later this summer for the 20th anniversary. But this is, you know, one of many storms that kind of leads to this repetitive trauma that these communities have to deal with, both in St. Bernard and Plaquemines. And, you know, this is from IDA, but to give you a sense of when you live at the bottom, when you have an evacuation order, they are the first that have to get evacuated. They evacuate from the bottom up to make sure that when traffic starts, that they've got the people from the bottom out first. I won't get into contraflow, Google it if you want. It's like a demon or Beetlejuice, you can't say it 3 times or it'll. But that, you know, these are just, this is part of life down there, and it's real and it's not fun. And then we talked about the oil spill a little bit. I didn't want to put a bunch of pictures of like oiled birds and stuff up here, but I guess what I want to say about the oil spill is it's something I think we've forgotten about a little bit, in the sense about how traumatic this was for the people, I think particularly in Plaquemines Parish. Barataria Bay was incredibly oiled. People got sick. The Corexit dispersant that was used to help sink the oil afterwards, you know, made people sick. And, you know, people thought that their livelihoods were going away. Anyone that was working on the water, working in the seafood industry, thought that, this was the end. It was really, really bad for a long time. And yeah, another just part of the story. And, this was 5 years after Katrina. People were still recovering when this happened. Recent fisheries disasters, COVID. I don't think anyone's dealt with COVID properly, but obviously this was, a major hit for anyone working on the water. A huge, all the restaurants were closed. It was a huge disruption for the supply chains. Then we had Ida in 2001, which sunk about 30% of the shrimp fleet. It ruined docks, gas stations and freezer stations were without power for a very long time. And then there was just debris everywhere, clogging waterways. And then in 2003, we had a disaster declaration for the foreign imports that was mentioned earlier. The price of shrimp at the dock went so low that it was costing more in gas for shrimp boats to go out and catch shrimp than they were making back when they got back to the dock. And then there's just the fact that the fleet is aging, and I would say, I'm not a mental health professional, but there's a lot of unaddressed mental health issues really going on everywhere. Maybe everywhere. In the climate world, but definitely I think in places like this, there's, just anecdotally, I think you hear a lot about suicide and heart attacks and, I think a lot of people are just going through it. We talked about population shifts. This isn't the map I wanted to find. There's a really good map. Charles and I both looked for it about post office consolidations. Things are just moving up, and services are going away and becoming scarcer. This is, a trauma on its own when your grocery store's closing, your school's closing, there's, one less hospital to go to. And then the land loss in itself, which we've talked about. How's it going? Like ancient graphics and yeah, we talked about this, but yeah, Barataria Bay has lost a lot of land. And that brings us to the project. Mid-Barataria, has been covered already, but like this, every time we've got a plan or model run, like this is the project science is telling us we need to save Louisiana. Or Barataria Bay. These are some really boring slides I'm gonna skip through because they're really boring, but just know that we did a lot of work around public engagement throughout this whole process, going back to 2017. We partnered with groups like the Environmental Law Institute of the Gulf to help people understand NEPA, which is confusing, and scoping. But we did workshops in Plaquemines and Orleans to get comments or to get scoping comments in, which helps frame up what they will look at in the EIS. Then we had the draft EIS, which I think most of which was still during like lockdown COVID times, but we did so much stuff. We had billboards, we had all sorts of stuff, digital marketing campaigns, paid media campaigns, we did videos. Simone was hosting podcasts. We did a lot. Action alerts, my team was mostly focused on getting like individual grass tops, we call them, submitting like personal comments and helping share stuff on social media. We were working with the legislature. We were doing lots of field trips in those days because they were outside. And we were doing a lot of webinars and that sort of thing. In between the DEIS and the EIS, so they got 40,000 public comments on the draft environmental impact statement. which, resulted in some changes, which were addressed, nothing like major in the like outcomes. You've seen some of these slides already, but the state also engaged in its own like massive public outreach campaigns during these times. I couldn't find a good slide about the mitigation, but these guys covered it pretty well, but just know that there were a lot of meetings around the mitigation as well, including surveys, the fisheries survey, was translated into Vietnamese and Cambodian. And a lot of, I think, really thoughtful work went into this. There was additional work that happened in Ironton, which is a community that is like not officially part of the mitigation, but is nearby. Or it's not in the EAS because there's not supposed to be impacts, but it's so close that folks at the time at CPRA decided to go in because that community just like really needed some help, especially post Ida. This is a like predominantly Black community that like didn't have running water until like the 1970s. They were left outside the levee system. A lot of historical racism, and that's like a whole nother presentation. But additionally, Louisiana has a master plan. We talked about this as well. From the community engagement side, every year there's an annual plan which outlines the spending. I'm gonna keep going, but we got lots of meetings. We did meetings in like people's living rooms, we do meetings in boats. Like I said, we partnered with groups like Coastal Communities Consulting, which helps mostly Vietnamese and Cambodian fishermen navigate all sorts of processes like taxes and FEMA claims. We hosted some meetings with them that were translated. I'm running out of time, so I'm just gonna keep going. This is just to say, this is something I came up with some projects I'm working on with Ducks Unlimited, but just about setting expectations, and we'll get into this in the discussion, but like how much outreach is enough outreach. And outreach at the end of the day is just like a piece of the pie. And I think one of the things like we have to be better at is making sure when we're doing outreach, folks know where our outreach is going, and how it fits into the planning for projects. And more food stuff. But we talked about polling, but Louisianans time and time again support all these things. We did oversampling in St. Bernard and Plaquemines, and everyone still supports this project. So the opposition, I struggled a lot with what to say here. But I think there's a narrative out there about the kind of big bad state coming in with this big project. And sometimes the big bad green NGOs coming in and telling people what to do. And these poor, small fishermen are gonna get, put out of business, and it's this like terrible thing. And again, this is just my opinion and observation, but I think at the end of the day, the reality is that there is a very small group of loud people who don't want this project for, whatever reason. And that, they have, maybe reasons to mistrust the government, going back to Carnarvon, and believe me, Carnarvon comes up in conversations to this day. You can hold a grudge from 100 years ago, it's someone in Louisiana. But the majority of people in Plaquemines do want this project, and we have the polling to show that. And I think that's the important thing to hold on to, and that we have done a lot of work, and I'll get into that, because I think that's the more important thing to talk about, to get people together who do support the project, to feel comfortable, because I think they've honestly been intimidated by some of these louder folks, into speaking up to support it, because there's basically been almost like bullying going on, in the parish, to not support this project. And we've talked about this, but like the estuary is changing no matter what. And so if we don't do this project, we're gonna probably lose everything. And that is not an exaggeration. So the Plaquemine Supporter Group was started by my colleague Alex Giles. And she really just started bringing people together. You know, we had people here and there who really supported the project. You know, not all of them willing to speak publicly about it. And so she started just kind of one by one, pulling them together, you know, often in people's living rooms, letting them know they weren't alone, creating this space to kind of start strategizing about what to do, sharing information, and it kind of just slowly built from there. And over time, it led, you know, to more and bigger actions. They ended up doing a letter to the governor that got 102 signers on it, which may not sound crazy, but is pretty impressive for, you know, Plaquemine's parish. They're all Plaquemine's parish residents. For, you know, maybe a year ago, no one wanted to say anything. That got placed in the hands of the governor at an event called Politics with a Punch. And, you know, they placed 5 letters to the editor, and they've done all sorts of things, which has been really great. And then kind of most recently, which I think is probably the most bold thing that they've done, is several of them have joined an intervention from a lawsuit between the parish and the state, that the state has basically stopped fighting, or at one point they were fighting each other, and now it's more like the parish and the state are on the same side. And so the residents have filed an intervention, asking, you know, basically that they move forward with everything. And it has, you know, put them at pretty significant risk. They're worried about not getting permits for their own projects now, that there's gonna be retaliation from the parish, but they're doing it. I'm very proud of them. Here's some suggested reading, some of which has nothing to do with any of this, but I think has a good vibe on what I think is going on here, including my podcast. I'm sorry, this went way over. This is a complicated story, which we'll get into.
All right, thank you, Sam. Thank you for talking about really just some of the most important part of our work. We're gonna close it out a little bit. In January of, if we're in 2025, in January 2024, Louisiana got a new governor. I think 2 or 3 months after that, they stopped work on the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion that was already under construction. We went to construction in August of 2023, and so the new governor came in and within a month or two stopped work on that project. In the summer, they had a little bit of relief. They did a little bit of work on the project, so essentially for a little over a year, they have not worked on a project that they have had fully funded with non-taxpayer dollars, had a national contract with 98 subcontractors attached to it. They have not moved forward with that project. They have spent $571 million of oil spill dollars already on that project, and they are not moving forward with that project. They've asked for another $200 million to spend on I'm not sure what, because they haven't been working on the project for over a year. And so, you're like, Simone, you got good news? No, I don't. We set up this entire presentation to tell you the extensive work that's been happening in Louisiana, to talk about our risk, to talk about the opportunities to mitigate that risk. We talked about all the work that went into our science-based comprehensive coastal master plan, how we finally had money and the stars aligned for us to construct a cornerstone project of that. We began work on that project. We talked about, I don't think we even said it, 6 years to obtain a permit on that project, tens of thousands of comments, thousands of interactions in our communities. A new governor came in and stopped work on that project. Sam told you that they had 100 people bold enough to sign a letter to say we need to move forward. They had people bold enough to walk into a court and say, we want this project and we care about it enough that we are going to go to court about it. And so what do you do? What do you do when you think you have put all of these things in place and something like that changes? You heard about if you do nothing, half of that parish will be gone, half of it. We talk about all these things. Unfortunately, bad things happen in Louisiana, and we learn lessons from them. We thought we had a great story to tell you guys about resilience and planning, and we're here today to tell you about some of the tough things that we've learned. And so we're gonna leave you with this just a little bit, and then we're gonna have just a few questions for our panelists. And then we are going to take questions, and then of course we'll be around afterwards too. So I think we highlight a couple of big lessons learned here. One thing, Charles mostly crafted, basically did most of our homework on this, but I want the thing that just struck me the most as somebody who does this work every single day is that last bullet item. Inequities of majority rule should not be replaced by inequities of minority rule. Is it a single stakeholder group? Is it a single parish that is making these decisions for our entire coast? And that we have to be able to balance all of these things in the future. Because this is what our future looks like. This is what we are faced here in coastal Louisiana. If we take action. But this is, some of the things that we're looking at, flood deaths, et cetera. So how can Louisiana survive the next 100 years? So we talked about using the power of the Mississippi River. We talked about, the importance of science-based planning for the long term. In Louisiana, we can't just do things for tomorrow. It's the whole give a man a fish, teach a man a fish kind of thing, right? I have kids. I want to be able to plan for their future too. And then, just could not say it enough that this environment and in Louisiana, our coast should be a voting issue. It should be something that we ask our legislators. We had, in the election for governor, we had some of the lowest voter turnout ever. We had and we won by, the governor won by a majority in the first round and didn't even go to a runoff. Charles, you said last night at dinner, more people voted,
For Biden and Kamala Harris, independently, in a very red state, he did not get very many votes.
Right. So that election mattered. In our Louisiana legislature, more than half of the people run uncontested. So they just walk into office. And so the environment and the coast has to be a voting issue. So I'll leave you with our social channels as we throw some softballs, questions to, I'm sorry, no time? Okay.
So we could,
Okay, last word to everybody here.
Well, apologize if we get to more questions. We are here, if we all want to talk about it, how it applies to your work. I just think that, what do I think? I mean, it just goes to show the complexity of all this planning work, all the outreach you do, all the science you do. How do you just actually deliver on some of these projects that you spend so much time building the support for and the case for, if infrastructure takes 20, 30 years to actually get built? And we really don't know what's left for this region. I mean, the framing of this too is just like, so kind of along Sam's line of thought, all this like government promising things or doing things to you and then kind of not following through. We're kind of in that situation a little bit now where the people that have gotten behind it, or this science process, we're like, okay, this is the right thing to do. Now we don't have that anymore, and so do you start back over with those same communities and say, this time we mean it, we're with the government, we're here to help, or this time it's gonna look different? We actually don't have a clear path forward on what adaptation looks like. The politicians are not demanding that those mitigation projects get built with other money or different money so that they can at least address today's risk. They're talking about some short-term fixes in the region from a restoration point of view. They're very short-term and they're actually not even fully baked. They're not even really committed to them. They're just kind of giving it lip service while they walk away from it. So we really are at a place where we don't actually know how to continue to engage with communities, even though we have this long history, because we keep undermining ourselves at every turn. So it's a dilemma, and I wish we had more time to talk about it, but I appreciate y'all being here. And anyway, yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Do you want to ask any questions while we're?
Some of y'all have to go somewhere else, so that's fine.
So the governor at first said he was just reconsidering, and we were like, well, that actually has already been considered, but so he said he wanted to reanalyze everything.